What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favalli, coming at you with a first-time guest who was kind enough to agree to hop on the podcast for an inaugural debut. We'll see if he realizes it'll be a mistake in just a few minutes. It is the great, the legendary Samson Folk. He creates great podcast and written content for Raptors Republic. Follow him on Twitter at Sam Folk. That's at SAMFOL. KK, and follow Raptors Republic. The content coming out there is just YouTube. Writing is incredible at Raptors Republic, spelled exactly as it sounds. His bio says your fave writer talker, and he is indeed one of my fave basketball talkers. So, Samson, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. How are you doing?
Doing good. Extremely happy to be on. And the compliment I said I was keeping tucked away is that your set of topics / info was the best I've ever received pre-podcast. So if Blake Murphy is listening from the Raptor show, it's better than his Google Doc. I was very impressed. Not only like good questions, but you layered in your own info, your own knowledge about that stuff. And I was, for a person who's not on the Raptors beat, just based on what you have written, you're observing things that aren't being observed by everybody over there. So impressed.
Well, one, thank you so much. Two, it's always nice to hear that people don't hate the outlines, because when I do team look aheads before the season where we do like 70 minutes on every single team, my outlines can be like 800, 900 words, because I want the people who are following these teams intimately to realize like, hey, you're watching this team more than I am. You know so much more about them, but I'm not just coming on to talk about, can the Raptors now trade Gary Trent Jr. or where's Bruce Brown headed? So I want you to know that I do put thought and research into it, but it's also, it's good prep for me, but it's nice to hear that you don't hate it, because I've been told by some people they don't like to receive them anymore because they're too long. So if they want to go off the cuff,
really?
I do. They're not mean about it, but it's just, I want the guests to know that like, hey, you're not coming on to just another, like, I'm trying to get you to say like some hot takey things, and the outlines are like my way of showing that.
I had one of those this year, actually. Just one, because I don't do podcast guest stuff that much, but I did have one where like the promotion of the podcast afterwards, I was like, yo, what the hell is going on here? So yeah, kind of funny.
So you don't do a lot of guest spots? I would assume that like are you just bombarded with requests and you can't handle them all? Because that's how I've approached a lot of radio requests now. Just because they come in such volume after the Super Bowl over here, and they're always like, hey, can you come on in like 90 minutes after the trade deadline's over? And it's like, no, I can't. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm pretty picky, to be quite honest with you.
Well, now I feel even more special that you agreed to come on.
Well, actually, Caitlin has told me before that she thought you were like one of the best in the world at what you do. So when you asked, I was like, I have been told that Dan is extremely good at his job. So I figured
my
like,
ego is just inflated. Getting a compliment from CC is a big deal, and she has mentioned you off air and on air when we do our little Pacers confab.
Cool.
So she was actually the one that turned me on to you a couple years ago. So thank you for coming on. We are here for the Toronto Raptors, though. I think is that anyone can see based off your background. I have to start with the trades, and I've listened to a couple of the pods that you've recorded since. It does seem like you were much warmer on the OG return rather than the Pascal return at first. And so it's kind of a twofold question of what are your general impressions coming out of those moves, and have they changed it at all since the initial just reactions that you've had?
I think that Bruce Brown having a reportedly hot market could change it, because this is something I wondered about too, because there's like trade valor, Rudy Gobert has immense trade valor because he got like this huge package. Right. Pascal Siakam's trade valor was lower, but if you consider Bruce Brown not his own trade tree, but like a branch of Pascal Siakam's trade tree, and it ends up being not like 3 late firsts, but it ends up being maybe like 2 mid firsts, because you get something back from Bruce Brown, and there's like a player in addition to, let's say, like maybe it's, I don't know if Jordan Nwora will be on the Raptors. I don't know what happens with anything like that, or Kira Lewis, but we'll see. But I do think that the Raptors and the Knicks, despite being engaged in a petty, litigious fight with one another, they managed to thread an incredible needle that doesn't often get threaded in the NBA, in that the Knicks are obviously, what are they, like 10-2 since the trade, or 11-2? They've been awesome. OG plugs into their offense perfectly and their defense perfectly. He elevates them in many ways. And the Raptors got two guys in RJ and Immanuel Quickley that obviously elevate what they're trying to do and help them kind of change up the future in a way that makes you think that those guys can be part of the now and the future, and in a way that the fans love, in a way that the front office loves. And that's a hard needle to thread, to be quite honest with you, especially for an expiring contract, a guy who's very good, but a guy who will probably never be selected as an all-star in OG. And then Pascal, who is obviously around all-star impact and has like all-star accolades and all that kind of stuff, all NBA as well. You get a package that you could probably, by the time it runs out, do you in the 3 first-round picks, most of them being late, does that equal 2 better players than like RJ and Immanuel Quickley? You would presume not. So it seems a little bit light, especially based on what I was hearing during the summer and based on past packages I've heard. So I was really, really impressed with the OG return immediately. I was underwhelmed by the Pascal return, and I still feel that way, but, no crying over spilled milk or something like that.
I will say very quickly on the litigation between the Knicks and Raptors, the fact that RJ is shooting like a zillion percent at the rim is kind of proof that the Raptors aren't really co-opting anything that they might have taken from the Knicks. So I feel like that should just be thrown out on this basis alone. You did mention, though, that in part you were impressed because of the OG return since he was an expiring contract. Both of these guys were expiring contracts. Yep. Making these moves was smart just because we saw what happened with Fred VanVleet. But do you think they waited too long, and that either in the sense of, one, they could have gotten more for even both OG or Pascal, or just two, because why did we wait so long to kind of clarify that we're trying to reorient around Scottie Barnes?
Yeah, I think that it's tough because everything is relational. You wonder if when they go into trade talks, Masai says, I let Fred walk. You have to trade to get OG Anunoby because I'll let somebody walk. You have to trade to get Pascal Siakam because I'll let somebody walk. You wonder about the impact of that stuff, or OG being traded. Like, for example, last year, what I heard was that it was Evan Fournier and 3 late firsts for OG. That was the trade that was offered. That's what I heard. I think that Immanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett is better, even if Precious Achiuwa and Malachi Flynn are involved in that. I also heard that, you're looking at a couple first-round picks, Buddy and Nembhard, in the summer for Pascal. I consider that better than what the Raptors got here. So I think that they upgraded in the OG sense, waiting. And the Knicks obviously were able to give more because the Knicks really liked the look of their team and thought adding OG was very meaningful. And the Pacers, and just because of, Pascal not Masai having to apologize to him, Masai saying, like, not talking with Pascal over the summer.
Yeah.
Relationships, they obviously still have a very strong bond, but the relationship stuff, the interpersonal stuff in the meantime, deteriorating. Pascal, the messaging around him from the front office being confusing and a little bit like distant at times, that affected it. And I think so I think that they upgraded on one by waiting and lost out on another. And it's really hard to be a GM or a president or all that kind of stuff and make decisions because none of them are made in a vacuum, but we have to view all of them in a vacuum to observe anything because there's like information asymmetry always. And that's like the job. So combining both, I think they made out pretty well. Although I think that it's possible that instead of trading for Jakob Poeltl last trade deadline, they could have perhaps pivoted earlier and would have probably a more stocked cupboard, let's say.
And there wouldn't be the debate of, do we want this pick to convey this year? Do we want it to convey?
That's a big one.
Yeah. I'm team let it convey this year, just because I don't know enough about the draft, but people aren't too high on it. And if you have a couple other firsts in the draft anyway, you can take your shots. So I'm team. I don't know where you land. I was actually listening to the podcast you recorded with S. Barahini, and you guys were having that combo. I can't remember where you land, but I'm team let it convey this year.
Sure. And just to that point, like, and you would have heard me make this point on the podcast, but when we were talking to Masai, and he talked about during the Jakob trade, like a year ago at this point, how he didn't like the 2024 draft. And then he was asked, like, well, now you have 3 picks in the 2024 draft, potentially. And who knows what comes back in the Bruce Brown trade? Could be 4. And then when he was asked if he likes the 2024 draft, Masai was like, "Oh, Dan Tolzman is gonna, he's gonna kill me. He's on my shoulder because he doesn't like the draft, and he didn't want to say it because he's like, well, should I publicly lower my ability to like leverage things in trade talks by saying, So a lot of people have thoughts about this draft. I think probably it's maybe better to convey. Yeah.
I am still shocked that even though he's on an expiring contract, that they didn't get a little bit more, as in one of the blue chippers from the Pacers, or even like you've mentioned this a bunch of time. Andrew Nemhard would have been like
I
a
love him.
fantastic get for them. And I'm just the discussion around like, well, now you have to max out Pascal for probably 4 years, and I'm just like, well, duh. Like Pascal's an All-NBA player, and he's just so good. And I guess nationally, I land higher on Pascal Siakam, where all these other people are just concerned about his next deal. And I was like, give me the next 3 or 4 years of Pascal at max money. So I thought they were going to get more for him. I thought the OG Anunoby trade at the time was basically a win-win, and it certainly looks that way right now. But because you got picks as the meat and potatoes of the package for Pascal, and then it was very player-based for OG, what does that say about their overarching direction now?
So I wrote this piece where I was kind of talking about like, do the Raptors go fast or slow in regards to team building? And I think they have the ability to do whichever one they want. Like you look at the Raptors when they won the championship, they were trying to, for years and years and years, build a team around Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan that eventually became a contender. And they made a trade, Terrence Ross and a first-round pick for Serge Ibaka. And Serge Ibaka at that point in time was meant to legitimize a power forward spot that hadn't been legitimized since Chris Bosh. Years in between those two things. You had Tyler Hansbrough and Jared Sullinger and all these guys, kind of as interim power forwards. But it ended up being that Serge Ibaka didn't win a championship as that guy. He won a championship as a bruising backup center who kind of obliterated the Warriors as Pascal Siakam stepped into that power forward role. On top of that, you had a trade that worked then and in the future. You had talent acquisition, and that's what Immanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett are supposed to be. And then you have a trade like Grievous Vasquez gets traded to the Bucks because the Bucks want to legitimize their backcourt, and you end up getting 2 picks that end up being OG Anunoby and Norm Powell. Norm Powell becomes a guy via the draft, talent acquisition in the draft, that allows you to trade Terrence Ross. Everything's relational. I think that the Raptors will be at their best making decisions, not from the point of like, hey, we're going specifically through the draft, or hey, we're trying to acquire guys that help Scottie now, but based on opportunity, because that's what it is. And also they were only able to do that for Serge Ibaka because Orlando had put themselves in a weird team building corner that they had to trade out of, and the Raptors took advantage. So I like that they got both types back. Obviously, it would be cool if they had gotten, like, I think Nemhard would have sewn up the backcourt in a really tidy way. I think he and Quickley could have like won a lot of minutes together, and they could have like tried to push for play-in, maybe not this year, but definitely next year, that kind of stuff. It would expedite rebuilds, etc. But I think having access to both gives them flexibility. And what they did from a team building point of view, I thought they built their team into a corner under the housing of Vision 6-9, that it was some players only had surplus value, let's say, were only able to overachieve in very specific contexts. And other teams around the league were seeing that as like, these guys don't have value as trades. These guys don't have value at wherever else. And it also meant that as the team changed, they're like flotsam in the background. They're like, okay, how do we get these guys to work in this upcoming context? And they need more talent acquisition for guys who succeed in a broader range of scenarios. They need more talent acquisition just to like perform better. And they need talent acquisition that kind of fits Darko's vision of how he wants to play, because Darko came into this season with a roster that was ill-fitted to his style, I guess. And also, I'm pretty sure when he came on, they told him that Pascal Siakam wouldn't be a Toronto Raptor, right? So like not a lot of his messaging or like the offense was built around him initially. So there will be more unity from everybody, and everybody can work together in harmony to try and make the best decision one step at a time. And that can be through the draft or through, acquiring immediate talent, I suppose.
Still, so you mentioned the Darko and like Siakam not being a prominent part of the offense. I'm still so bummed at how that the relationship just ended between Pascal and Toronto. Even the Masai presser where he just admitted that, yeah, he got emotional and like Pascal was important to him, but he basically said, yeah, the communication broke down. We just weren't talking. And I was like, that's just sad. Like, just
Well,
knowing that
it was
they're big.
one side that wasn't talking. Pascal and his team were. So it's just, yeah, that's on Masai. I gotta say.
So it's interesting because the flexibility is good and they've set themselves up to do a variety of things, which Masai has done in the past. You outlaid it at the beginning of sort of his Raptors tenure. And then also he did that with, this was basically the Melo trade rolled into one when you look at Denver,
Sure.
where they got all the picks, but then also these guys where that one Nuggets team, like Gallinari's headlining it and they won 57 games or whatever it was in 2012. But what do you think that does to their approach for the rest of this season, specifically leading into the next couple weeks of the deadline? Because you have this flexibility. Part of that flexibility, though, is the Bruce Brown and Gary Trent Jr. could be expiring contract for Bruce Brown, because you could have 30 plus million in cap space while keeping Immanuel Quickley's cap hold. Do you have a sense of how important that is to them? Or when you mentioned Bruce Brown's trade value and maybe getting a first or more back, are they a team that would be willing to say, oh, you want longer term money on our books, but you're going to compensate us for that? Yeah, we'll eat up that cap space. We don't value the financial flexibility that hard.
I think that it's very possible that happens. I think that they'd be happy to go either way. This goes back to like what is advantageous at the time, but the Raptors, Masai was joking about it during that same press conference we're talking about, where he shed tears, he laid it bare, but he also kind of was laughing, to himself and with everybody in the room, that he's like, a lot of the best free agents on the market, especially free agents not restricted, are guys who used to be Raptors. Like that's just how it is, right? Now, it's like, I don't know if anybody would consider Kyle Lowry one of the best, but like Pascal, OG, before Kawhi like re-signed, it would have been Kawhi. There's like, it is kind of funny how that shakes out. And as far as like taking on salary, trying to pursue guys with cap space, if they have cap space, I wouldn't be surprised if they like throw an offer sheet at, let's say, like Nicholas Claxton or something like that. I think that would be an interesting, yeah, he's awesome. That'd be an interesting way to go. I think having a vertical lob threat is something that helps leverage Scottie's pick and roll stuff, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But I think that they'd be happy to go either way. If it is truly advantageous to take, salary on, I'm sure they would. And then if they have money, try to use it. It's tough to use money when you're not one of like 7 teams in the NBA, but the Raptors are probably not one of those 7 teams. But
Right.
you try, you see if you can get somebody to come north of the border, see how that goes.
Well, and the money can also be valuable in the offseason for trades if they were looking at trying to acquire someone who they think fits their timeline as an impact player, which is why I was curious whether you thought they'd be willing to take on money. And so, kind of to wrap up their approach to the trade deadline stuff, when you're looking at some of these guys like a podcast favorite, Chris Boucher, Dennis Schroeder, Bruce Brown, Gary Trent Jr., is there anyone specifically that you might expect to be moved? Or is there even of that group, or do you look at any of those guys and say, well, I'd actually like to see them stay with this team through this season and into next year?
I think that it could be like, it's possible for, as you got written here, like Bruce, Chris, Gary, Dennis, any of those guys could go. Jordan Nwora could go. The Raptors, they're perfectly happy to like make the move if it's there. Based on interest, I'd say probably Bruce Brown and Chris Boucher, I think, are the most likely. Chris Boucher is a guy who teams have asked about every year for like 3 years. He's had like a healthy amount of interest across quite a few years, from like whether it's like Western Conference contenders or Eastern Conference contenders. People look at him and think like he maybe could like help swing a couple games down the stretch of a season. And if he's like playing well and he ends up fitting the context we want, there's some playoff games that he kind of like snugly fits into for us. So Chris, I could expect that to happen. Bruce Brown is obvious. Bruce is really good. He won a championship last year as like a major player on the Nuggets. And the way people view his game and kind of what Darko talked about when Bruce first came over, Darko was like, oh yeah, I studied Bruce's cutting specifically because I thought he was the best cutter in the league like 2 years ago. And that holds true. Bruce is a super cerebral player. He has tremendous feel for the game. A lot of contenders view him as like a guy who just plugs right in. So those guys for sure, I think, have a really strong likelihood. I think Blake also had mentioned on the Raptors show that he thought like Chris was probably, there's a very, very strong likelihood that Chris is gone by, trade deadline. So that kind of stuff. Dennis Schroeder, I think that the Raptors value Dennis, what he brings to like stabilize the offense and some of the defensive matchups that he has. And I think they're pretty okay with like his contract, the mid-level exception.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't surprise me if he stuck around. I know like Raptors fans think he gets too much of the ball, but Darko loves point guards and he loves having point guards move them through their offense. So I think he sticks around. And Gary, I just think because of what he's achieved in the past, what he's underwhelmed as currently, I think probably the inflection of what the Raptors are asking for versus teams trying to take like a flyer on him as an expiring contract is probably tough to make a trade happen. So I'd go Chris and Bruce if I had to guess.
I think I'd probably agree with you. Gary Trent Jr. is still just so weirdly important to this team, even though he's such an imperfect player. Isn't that bizarre?
Yeah. He was in such a unique situation 2 years ago, 2021-22, because the Raptors were like, we have all these players who can play make. We have all these guys who can score, but none of them really shoot the ball well. And Gary, they're just like, hey, you don't really make passing reads. Your defense is like really gamble heavy. You don't really stick your man, but you can hit catch and shoot threes. And you also can kind of like boogie woogie and get to like a 19-foot pull up. And for a while, he was next to like Seth and Steph Curry and Kevin Durant for like mid-range pull-ups and like extremely difficult ones. He had a run of play that was just immense as a shooter. And it started to give people like this outsized look of what his offense was, something I always disagreed with, but something that picked up steam in Toronto was fans called him Gary Beal, which is still insane, just absolutely insane. But I'll tell you this much. Gary has an extremely valuable skill that is kind of shrouded in like a super underwhelming skill set. And he's still young, technically. He still like has avenues to make playmaking reads because he has so much gravity. He had like, a 3-week stretch where he averaged 4 assists a game because he just decided to make the read to the guy rolling off of a dribble handoff when he was receiving pressure. Maybe a team watches that film and says like, okay, let's make it happen. Like maybe it's Miami or something that says, hey, we can do this kind of stuff. But I don't know. He was weirdly put in such a great spot to just like score the ball and have all of his limitations papered over by the Raptors. And then once the Raptors changed the context a little bit, that stuff really started showing up, especially with like continuous motion offense, a lot of ball screens, making progressive reads, getting to the next action, like that kind of stuff. Gary is maybe not best suited for it, but he still cans triples, and the Raptors are like, gimme. So yeah, I don't know, man. It's tough.
He's also first team I forget how young he is all the time. Like, he just turned 25 a week ago, or whatever it was. Like, he's just, and I remember like 2 years ago, like he's 22. Like, how is he only 22? It feels like he's been around.
When he got traded to the Raptors, even though the Raptors had drafted Malachi Flynn that year, even though they had drafted Jalen Harris that year, he was their youngest player.
Wow, I didn't
Isn't that nuts?
That's
it
wild.
Blew everyone's mind.
Because he was traded for Norman Powell, I always just assumed they were like the same age. That's a stupid way to look at it, but I just assumed.
That would be kind of funny if like you had to do a trade. Like these guys have to be like, there's like a problematic age gap discourse about NBA trades.
Maybe in the next CBA. That's the next limitation I'll add. I have actual basketball on the court questions for you though, as promised. RJ Barrett, who has been, I don't know that I flip-flopped on a player more. I was initially team, no, I wouldn't include him in the Donovan Mitchell trade package. I was out on RJ Barrett by the time they actually moved him. So naturally, I've been waiting for his efficiency to come down in Toronto. It hasn't. And I think it will. There will be peaks and valleys from the perimeter. But his finishing, specifically, he's at like 70% around the basket per cleaning the glass. And the Raptors, I think Knicks fans are sensitive to this, but just based off what I've seen and having seen a lot of him in New York, they're doing an excellent job of getting him the ball with heads of steam already, where he doesn't necessarily have to create from stops. Is that one accurate? And two, do you think this kind of unlocks? Because he's always kind of had the strength and the ability to get there, but do you think that the way they play is built to unlock maybe a more permanently efficient finisher and threat at the basket.
I do. I think that this was something. Do you know who Polar is? Like the Korean MD on Twitter. So his name is Polar Fall, and he's a Korean guy. He's an MD, and he talks about biomechanics. I co-wrote a piece about Scottie Barnes biomechanics with him once, and he talked about how RJ Barrett, because of his biomechanics, is a guy who needs to be put on more curved drives just because of his physical makeup, and how that allows him to kind of like accentuate his physical makeup and how it like makes him better and more explosive curved drives. Same with like Scottie Barnes and OG Anunoby for that matter. It's been interesting to see the Raptors get him into motion out of more dribble handoffs. They run a ton of like weak side stuff to occupy taggers, and then put RJ in high ball screens where he's moving left, but can make that sweeping left to right pass because he's a very talented left-handed passer, even if some of the reads over the course of his career have been underwhelming. That's a big deal. Also, something that like a couple scouts and one in particular, Joshua Codenera, had talked to me about when RJ got traded there is that there's more inherent and intuitive lanes for him to fill on the court now that he's not surrounded by Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle, that as the lone lefty on the court a lot of the time, he's punching gaps that teams aren't geared up to defend. Okay. So teams, when you play the Knicks, you're like, okay, we have Randle, we have Brunson, we have Barrett. All of these guys are looking to punish the left side of the backboard. And Barrett is now the lone guy doing that on the Raptors. And the Raptors also went from having OG Anunoby as their third guy to RJ Barrett as their third guy. And RJ, as far as like taking a live dribble all the way to the rim, being able to navigate help defense, being able to make a progressive read, is just like OG is the better player, but RJ is way better at converting those possessions. The Raptors were left in limbo a lot of the time because they didn't have a guy outside of like Pascal or Scottie who could take that possession and score on it, or like take it deep into the paint and make a read to the opposite side of the floor. RJ is just taking all of these possessions that were like dead on arrival in Toronto and just injecting life into them. And it's resulted in defenses not being able to gear up for what he's going to do. It's resulted him breaking through the last line of defense a bunch, getting to his left hand repeatedly, sometimes without contests at the rim. And also when like, and he's had great reads on when guys are stunting to the lane and when guys are fully committing. That helps him strike like the perfect middle, the perfect medium between like making reads and attacking the basket. The Raptors have put him in motion. That's great. He's shot the ball well as far as like the jumper. That'll probably come down a bit. The floater stuff will probably come down a bit, but the rim stuff looks so easily replicable for him going forward. And I talked to him about this the other day, and like he bristled at the idea that he had changed. Yeah, he had bristled at the idea that he had changed. But then later on had mentioned that he likes what the Raptors are how the Raptors are using him. And he thinks that he fits well in this offense. And that's accurate as far as I can tell. He's been awesome. Sublime.
Based off like him being in motion and then even him being the lone lefty, could that by extension then help? I don't expect him to shoot 50% from mid-range or whatever it is forever, but could that help him like just generate more space from that area to where maybe this floater accuracy is more for real, or is this mostly going to be like an at the basket sort of thing?
I think I expect it to be mostly at the basket because a lot of the floaters are not a lot of the floaters come after spins. And I've been really impressed that he's been able to get a lot of them down because he's like spinning, stopping, locating the rim, putting the ball up, and against like pretty heavy contests, or like a half spin into the lane from a pinch post action or something like that. The shot making has been pretty ridiculous from the floater range. I don't know if that sticks, but that's not even the meat of like the shot diet anyway. Like it's been a good counter so far, but they've been really difficult shots that he's been making. Whereas the stuff at the rim for the most part has been like, he's getting there. The shot is easy because of the work he's putting in as a driver. Whereas like the floater shots, I'm like, this is insane touch. I've never perceived RJ as like an insane touch player. You know, you listen to the podcast, you probably heard me mention he's been below average everywhere on the court, every quadrant on the court, except for 1 year from 3. This isn't a guy who screams like incredible touch, but he screams like good enough touch with good driving, and we're seeing the realization of that in Toronto, which is awesome.
Is there anything else that you found surprisingly good or surprisingly concerning about his fit so far? As a just, are you done with him shooting 66% from the foul line or something like that?
No, like, I don't know. Raptors fans should be, they watch the team led by Pascal, Scottie, and OG. So the Raptors for like, I don't know, a third of the season were shooting like 70% as a team from the foul line. So RJ missing free throws. I could care less. What I really like is like he's a high free throw rate player. And I love high free throw rate players. Not in like the grimy, grifty sense, but like, I don't know, it's really good to get to the line. It's a huge feature of an offensive player's skill set, and RJ does that. I've been pretty impressed. Not only that he has like you know, lefties always have like a special quality because they're always like superhuman with their left hand. They can make like these crazy hook passes. They can like always have like an immense amount of strength to whip the ball across the court. But RJ has also made like these really good live dribble push passes out to the left side. And while I talked to, a couple times about making those left to right passes to open up the floor, if you're getting the help from the left side, a dig down there, that push pass to above the break or the corner, pretty important. And he's made that too. So that's been encouraging because I didn't see a lot of push passes when he was in New York. I haven't seen a ton of push passes when he was playing with Team Canada and FIBA. So, guys work on stuff that doesn't show up on the court anyway. This might be something he was working on for a long time, but that's been cool to see as well.
Yeah, his live dribble passing it's always to me been so
Yeah.
inconsistent that would be my concern. But I was looking before, and he's like passing on 40% of his drives, which is just by far and away. I know it's only a few games at this point, but that's by far and away a higher share than he was ever doing in New York. And I'm sure there will be those fits and bursts where he gets his tunnel vision or is just trying to spin to nowhere. But the fact that he's already doing that so much more frequently, in addition to just he's gone from 38% shooting on drives to 50% shooting. And some of that, like you said, is ridiculous shot making, but it's also the rim volume is up. And this was a player who was getting to the rim at a pretty high clip for his position to begin with. So to have both the share of his shots at the rim coming up in addition to the efficiency just feels like an absolutely massive deal, not just for the Raptors, but his development overall, because he's been one of the most divisive younger players essentially since entering the league.
It's been cool. I'm very, very happy for him because anytime I love when players are good. Like I love when players are good.
You don't root against players, contrary to popular belief that anyone who
Never.
covers teams roots against certain players.
Not my style, I suppose.
The Immanuel Quickley experience, I'm enjoying it in general just because it's more of Immanuel Quickley and his role was repressed in New York, just based off the rotation, but also Tibbs's unwillingness to be too experimentative or inventive. His floater will start falling. He's been like a jolt of adrenaline for the offense at points. Is there anything that has stood out to you though early on about his fit, or do you have concerns or thoughts about what does this player project as when looking as I don't want to say a lead initiator, but like your secondary initiator next to Scottie Barnes?
Yeah, I think Immanuel and RJ have had the opposite experience as far as like usage. RJ takes a trip like down the hierarchy, gets a little bit less, is put in like super advantageous positions, and has just been supercharged as a scorer in that case. Like he gets like 20 touches less per game than Immanuel and Scottie do. And he's just been scoring the hell out of the ball. Immanuel has to like take on all this extra usage, has to not be like a bench scorer, a spark plug guy. He has to suddenly like guide a team through most of its sets. He has to set everything up. He has to come down the floor, call everything out. Okay, here's what we're doing repeatedly. And his assist percentage has ballooned. Now, the Raptors have like extremely high shot quality everywhere on the court. Darko, I think, has done a great job implementing offense. They are an assist farm to some degree. Like anybody can walk in as a point guard and get assists for the Raptors. Dennis Schroeder was doing it all season. And big shout out to Darko for donating $20 or $25 for every assist to kids' hospitals, which is cool.
Yeah, that was cool.
But on top of that, Quickley, I think, has underwhelmed as a driver. I'm excited to see what that looks like with Jakob Poeltl back in the fold. or like a legitimate screening big. Because I know Indiana is the team that makes the least amount of contact on screens, like the league over. They slip, they slip, they slip. But the Raptors, outside of Jakob Poeltl, they slip a lot. Like asking Immanuel Quickley not only to come in and be like the lead guard now and say like, okay, you're the guy who makes this leap, but saying your bigs for the large portion of when you start doing this, it won't be Jakob Poeltl and Pascal Siakam and Scottie Barnes. It'll be like a lot of Jonte Porter and Thad Young. It's a big ask. And I've been surprised, I guess, at how little two-man actions they've gone to between Scottie and Immanuel. That's something I want to see supercharged. But on its face, and I was never, I didn't think Immanuel Quickley would be a future all-star necessarily. I wouldn't be surprised if he made like one or two, just because if you're on a really good team, if the Raptors are really good, I would suspect he features heavily. He bangs triples like crazy. He plays awesome off-ball defense. He clearly can like play make, that kind of stuff. But his driving game, I think, is perhaps underwhelming to a lot of Raptors fans who thought like Quickley, like he gets downhill, but you don't notice that like his touch at the rim is like he's overextending himself a lot. He picks up his dribble really early. Like that's something I talked to Eric Spoelstra about. And that stuff is like really, really important for lead guards to like control the ball, keep a live dribble, to keep the potential for playmaking alive longer on plays, put yourself in very dangerous positions. And he's kind of like, he's leaving meat on the bone, and he'll start eating more of that meat once he has a better screener, obviously. But right now, like there's clear limitations in his game. But he's also shooting the hell out of the basketball, like 45% from three. So the Raptors have put him in a really difficult position, I think. And he's struggling a little bit at some of the stuff, particularly as a driving force for the Raptors. But can that stuff improve incrementally? Of course. Immediately with the return of Jakob Poeltl, I think so. And can it become like more than palatable over time? I think so. And then you just reap all the extra rewards from a guy who has like really heady off-ball defense, a guy who is, on its face, one of the best three-point shooters in the NBA.
Oh yeah.
So that kind of stuff is really good. I'm still really happy with Quickley since then, but there's like clear limitations to his game that he'll work on over time, I'm sure.
What do you think will end up being the best type of big to put beside him to maybe streamline or optimize the playmaking? Is it a vertical threat? Is it someone like a Jakob Poeltl who could decision make and does so good at like reading to where he needs to be in space without the ball? Is it a pick and pop threat? Is there like, do you lean one way or the other with what type of big could maybe unlock his live dribble playmaking the most?
I think it is a guy like Poeltl. I think it is a guy like Hartenstein. I thought he had great chemistry with Hartenstein, particularly
Yeah,
like,
some of the second units were killer with those two on the court.
yeah, like a lot of the screen flipping, like a lot of the get actions, like a ton of that like intermediate stuff that he's been able to like dip, duck, and dodge around Hartenstein as they kind of wheel and deal as a two-man action. I think there's room for he and Jakob Poeltl to do a lot of that. I think there's room for he and Scottie Barnes to do a lot of that. Last season, among the high volume dribble handoff partnerships, the sixth most efficient one in the NBA was Gary Trent Jr. and Scottie Barnes. If you can get the sixth most efficient high volume with Gary Trent Jr. and you can't mine the partnership of Immanuel Quickley and Scottie Barnes for more than it's worth, I think you're making a mistake as like a front office and a coaching staff. I'm sure we'll see more of that coming soon. But I think Jakob is a really, really tidy fit with Immanuel Quickley. And the way they played together in the short little spurt made me feel a lot better about having both those guys locked up going forward. Of course, the Raptors can try and pivot from Jakob, but I really like Immanuel and Jakob together. I think they make sense. I think that they complement each other a lot.
Mhm.
And I think that Immanuel, like, he has played with that vertical threat in Mitch Robinson. He has played with like some of these like stockier, clever bigs in Hartenstein and Poeltl. And I tend to think like, just as Immanuel, as a guy who's trying to get his own game off, and a guy who picks up the ball too early heading downhill, because you want the late pickup. You want the late. You want to open up your lob threat. Then you keep your dribble alive. If you pick it up too early, then you get stuck in the photo range. The rear view contest is all you have to worry about, and the dropping big, or like wherever the big is in position, can start kind of like getting back to cover the lob. I think that it makes the most sense for Immanuel to be in the pick and roll making plays as like a pocket passer, or a late dump off wrap pass because he's picking up early or anything like that, or a skip out of it. So I think Hartenstein, Poeltl, that's a decent archetype for Immanuel to fit in with. I like it.
Do you think, just because we mentioned Jakob Poeltl a few times now, do you think that makes then Jakob Poeltl more critical to Toronto's future with this new iteration than it seems to suggest? Just because I think you look at it and it's, okay, you have RJ, Scottie, and IQ, and that feels like the core that you would lock down and you're going to try and retrofit the roster from there. Do you think Poeltl belongs in that tier of player, or is it more of a fluid placeholder type of situation with him?
I think probably fluid placeholder feels more accurate,
Okay.
but placeholders can be very important while they placehold. And I think it's really important for guys, particularly like guards, to get reps with good bigs.
Yeah.
Because like you could get like, man, you get like 900 pick and roll possessions. And if you don't have a good big setting screens, if he's not like opening up the passing window and maintaining it as a roller, keeping the space properly, if he's not like helping you out, like 400 of those possessions could just be like nothing. Like you're not getting to read the defense the way you're supposed to. You're not getting downhill the way you're supposed to. You don't even start thinking about, okay, now I seal, now I put a guy in jail and work from here. So having Poeltl as a guy to like run through reps with, I think will be tremendously helpful. And also like if you want to move on and get a guy different than Poeltl, okay. But I think he's a very important placeholder at this point in time. And also because Scottie has played a ton of minutes at the 5, because the Raptors have been getting absolutely clobbered without Jakob, just for guys' health, just for guys to like be put in their normal positions or expected positions, having a center to, take the beating of the front court over the course of 82 games is also extremely important too.
Do you have any insight into, or have you given any thought about the next Immanuel Quickley contract and if the organization has a walk away point? Because restricted free agency has become so prohibitive for outside. I get mad at outside teams all the time for not just throwing offer sheets and forcing rival teams to pay more. I like that gamesmanship. That's something I've always would have been a fan of. Quickley does feel like someone who's good enough where you look at some of the teams that might have cap space, if it's Detroit, if it's Orlando, if it's San Antonio, they could come in with, I don't know if they would go to the max, but even if they did, like the Raptors clearly traded for him with the intention of like, well, we're just going to pay what it costs to keep him, right? Because he was the centerpiece of that deal.
I think that like the Raptors aren't expecting gamesmanship, like a whole bunch, like that level of like, if like pay him the max or we will. These are high stakes, like for a team that wants to build, and like obviously that's incredible gamesmanship. Like it's very clever, it's very like cunning, but it's also, the Raptors did that once upon a time to the New York Knicks. They said, "Oh, we're gonna give Landry Fields all this money, so you have to match, and we're gonna get so you can't afford Steve Nash." And the Knicks were like, "He has uncurable nerve damage in his elbow. Here you go. And also, you don't get Steve Nash either. He's going elsewhere." And the Raptors were like, well, damn, that's like, they're like, okay, so Landry Fields can't shoot anymore. That sucks for us. We paid him a bunch of money, especially in that cap environment. It can backfire when you play those games. The Raptors have seen that for sure. If somebody threw Immanuel the max, I don't know. I eat my hat. But like there are teams that like, I don't know, you look at the Magic, that's a really good example. Why wouldn't the Magic throw some money at them? But I think they'd match, because how do you not match? How do you trade like OG and Pascal and have Fred walk? And then especially like you have Masai on the phone after the trade being like, we love the fit with Scottie. And then and I'm sure they sold Scottie on it. They've done a ton of messaging around Immanuel Quickley. And then they're just like, we didn't want to pay him as much as Orlando wanted to pay him. Would be tough, like really tough.
Yeah, his max would be like 4 and 153 from an outside team, which is just a massive number. But I would just, it's not, first of all, it's not my money. I don't care. I'm never going to root for like owners to save money. I would just pay him. But Scottie Barnes has gotten a lot of national love this year, which runs counter to what happened last season.
Face of the league.
Your face, that, by the way, that Darko rant, one of the most iconic ones of all time.
Yeah,
I was asked to rank it for a mailbag we did, and I was like, I don't know where it actually ranks, but it's an 11 out of 10. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much. So with Scottie, and he is my most improved player as of right now. I saw Nekias Duncan was kind of starting the Joel Embiid for most improved player bandwagon, and I'm sure a ton of people will board it.
Nekias, come on.
Look, I can't. I like when I find out that I agree with Nekias before knowing what he thinks. It makes me feel good. Like if it's you or Caitlin Cooper, I don't know what you guys think, and I find out we agree. It's great. This would be one I just diverged from on him. It's Scottie as of now for me. Let's start with the offensive end. What do you think is what's been most impressive or what stood out the most about his growth offensively this year?
So there's two big things. The first one is that, I've done this thing. I don't think I'll do it this year, but I've done it for his rookie season and his sophomore season where I watch every possession back and I track everything that's going on and I write these big pieces. And he was really, by the numbers, he really struggled in the pick and roll last year. That wasn't a place where he took a big step. And largely he struggled because he was facing unders, he was facing switches, and he was facing push switches. And he didn't really know how to initiate against all that kind of stuff. And it really made him struggle as a half-court scorer. So with that, Scottie was a guy who this season has been emboldened by Darko with more pick and roll possessions. Scottie is a guy who has made, incremental leaps as a driver and playmaker and in between shot maker. And all that kind of stuff has coalesced into where the numbers are much better than they were last season when you account for like playmaking and scoring. And he's facing a more diverse set of coverages. And because of his shooting leap, he's actually facing more aggressive coverages that really help him take advantage of his height as a passer. And so like you even see like these plays where he like wiggles downhill, like snakes the pick and roll, can play make like because of who Scottie is as a playmaker, he can play make to the above the break behind him. He can go to opposite corner, same corner, dunker spot, wherever it needs to be, he'll play make to. He's been really impressive there. Those types of steps as a lead initiator are huge. And part of that is like having a little bit better handle, getting through the reps, understanding how defenses are going to try and treat you, kind of being proactive as a playmaker and a scorer to like hedge against what they want to do. And then on top of that, a big reason why Scottie has been able to score more in the half court because he has limitations as a dribbler and like from a standstill to create stuff. I think that being able to hit above the break threes just means that he gets to take more shots in the half court.
He's still 37% on those. I know it's come down, but like 37% on above the break threes is great.
Yep. And on high volume, right? So that's fantastic. And that has been for Scottie, a guy who came into the league and scored on offensive rebounds, cuts, and in transition. And then his second season offensive rebounds, cuts, and transition, he'll like get 15 points a game doing just that basically until he's like 36, I'm sure. He just is able to do that. He's a physical, he's a beast out there. He's tough to contend with. He's so confident with a live dribble, particularly with his left hand going downhill in transition. He just forces the defense to make decisions. He'll always score there. In the half court, though, when there's like help defense present, guys are gapping him, all that kind of stuff is showing up. He might struggle to navigate those situations at this point early on in his career. But what simplified all that is just hitting threes. And it's 36.7% right now. It was 38 and above for a really long time. It's been 29% since the trade was made. I think just because of how good his touch is and has been since he came into the league, whether it's like at the rim or short mid range, he's passable from the free throw line. I think that he is like a passable to good above the break 3-point shooter. That's a massive step because he shot 29% from three last year. Yeah. It's something he struggled with immensely, and he just made this huge jump. And the type of jump he made is typically not made by wings. It's typically not made by guys in their third year. Usually it's like a guy like Julius Randle who is super streaky and has like 1 year where it's very bad and 1 year where it's very good. And then you look at that in like StatHead or something, and it says, this is the guy who made the jump. Scottie making it like 29 to 37.
Yeah.
Kind of nuts, right? Pretty crazy. So that's something that like those two things are the biggest motivators for offensive change and just having more possessions where he leads the offense in transition, having more possessions where he's the guy making the decisions, you're going to see a big bump in like playmaking. You're going to see a big bump in scoring and all that kind of stuff. So shooting and ball handling, I think, has been the biggest steps he's taken. And that's like a big deal. Huge.
Have you noticed anything different about like sort of his processing speed in the half court situations? Because the thing I noted too is it seems like his interior passing has got a lot better. And you even mentioned him finding guys in the dunker spot. And I was looking and watching a bunch of stuff on it, and it just feels. I know you said he can still struggle when he's like drawing doubles or collapses, but he feels like, I don't want to say night and day, but so much better there. And then I even went and looked it up, but like even if he's getting it with his back to the basket, like he has an assist rate of 31+% on elbow touches. So I looked up the field. I want to be clear. The volume is different, but only Zion and Jokic have like at least 100 elbow touches with a 30+ assist rate. That feels like kind of just a mega jump for him. Is that something that you've actually noticed, or did I just not notice enough of it during his first 2 years?
I think that it's helped that they're like the Raptors didn't cut very often the first 2 seasons.
Okay.
Like you'd see a guy like I never got to write the piece actually since Precious got traded, to be honest with you. But
that was my most improved player pick last season, by the way. Was Precious preseason? Was Precious Achiuwa? That didn't pan out so well.
I really like Precious still. He's had a couple awesome games with the Knicks, something to keep an eye on. But like Precious, for example, was 93rd in points per chance on cuts last season per second spectrum, right? But he was 16th in frequency, which isn't a lot. And the Raptors had a bunch of guys like OG and Pascal and Precious and Chris Boucher and Scottie, who, how do you get guys who are maybe like massive, finish really well, but are limited with a dribble? How do you get them to the rim? You cut. That way they don't have to dribble there themselves, to make them catch it high and keep it high, you know? Same with Jakob Poeltl. And the Raptors this season, way more cutting to help utilize those touches from Scottie and from Pascal when he was there, right? So that's probably a lot of the correlation I would expect is due to cutting frequency. But on top of that, like he is making better reads. He is drawing a little bit more aggressive defenses, which means that he gets to rely on not so much his shot making, but like his playmaking. So as a live dribble guy, there's like getting deeper, being a little bit more comfortable with contact, with guys crowding him from behind, not just like in front, that kind of stuff. Those are the small steps he'll continue taking. But as far as like being a guy who takes pressure, sees the release valve, finds it, or like feigns to the release valve and finds like the ultimate pass on a possession, he's so good at that. He's a tremendous and wonderful passer in the NBA for sure.
What's kind of stood out the most to you about his defensive progression this year?
Role change. I gotta be honest with you. The stuff on ball, I think there's incremental improvements because Scottie is very active. He's very long, but he doesn't have quick foot speed. He's not quicker than guards. And this isn't like, Florida State versus Gardner Webb, where he can just like eat a guy on the perimeter and like lock them between, a 2-foot square. He's getting beat on the perimeter, across his NBA career. So him learning that like I'm not going to just go like lock a guy up and press, and instead using his length to buffer and allow for like room to breathe for him to like pivot and swivel and respond to what they do is a big step he's made. He's still not super effective, but what the Raptors did was put him in like this backline sweeper role. It's been different since the trade a little bit. He had to guard at the point of attack more often, but at the start of the season anyway, the Raptors put Pascal Siakam on guards more often, and OG Anunoby, and Dennis Schroeder. And so Scottie was this backline sweeper that he's getting almost 3 stocks a game. Like the other night, he had 6 blocks. He's a very quick jumper, a very quick second jumper, which means he gets to wait longer. And he has super long arms, which means the combination of all those things and being an aggressive defender means that like he's going to try and play make a lot. And he's going to make the play a ton. You get to wait longer. You get to track steps. The longer a guy sits in the air, the less likely it is that he's going to pass. Scottie being able to wait as like a quick jumper with length to like clean, like sweep across the backboard. Super impressive. His reads like as a ball hawk, pretty impressive. He's just on the back line, creeping the baseline like a shadow cat, man. He's been so impressive to me there. And at some point he'll have to do the Jaren Jackson Jr. thing where, you weigh pursuing the block versus leaving your man for these rebounding positions. The Raptors aren't good enough for those types of considerations just yet, but making the step to where you're already one of the best defensive playmakers in the NBA, and then you refine from that point of view. I'm sure you're aware of PD Webb, on Twitter, the scout. I did a podcast with him right after Scottie got drafted, and he said, I know there's a bunch of on-ball stuff, but this backline sweeper, this big playmaker role on the back end thing, that's what he thought he would succeed at. Lo and behold, and same with Henry Ward, who now works in the NBA, but both of them felt like that was his role going forward, and both of them are successful scouts at this point in time, so they were right. So good on them for sure. He's been awesome.
I will say shot contests like that playmaking element of it has been fun. He already has more blocks outside the restricted area than he did all of last season.
Yep.
He blocked 15 3-pointers or something, which I would imagine is close to leading the league. So that stuff has been super. I love defensive playmaking. Even I know sometimes it comes at the expense of actual good defensive cover, but I love it. That's part of why I love Chris Boucher is just the anarchic closeouts that he still has. So what does the next frontier look like for him? That next level of stardom. We've talked, you talked about him initiating pick and roll. Is it, his pull-up jumper was falling at a very high clip for a good part of the season. That's kind of come back. Is it that? Is there something on defense? Is there even anything that has to do with him fitting in beside both Immanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett moving forward? Just anything along those lines?
I think the biggest thing that Scottie can do is probably the gettable thing right now is the free throw line to me. Okay. And Darko waxed poetic about it. He's like, Scottie doesn't really flop. Scottie sometimes doesn't play to the whistle. He'll start complaining before he'll receive contact. And it's he turns to the ref mid-drive. He doesn't flop, but he's looking at the ref and then turns and shoots and he won't get the call. Sometimes stuff like that happens, but I think that his foul rate should come up. His free throw rate should come up. And for a guy who I don't know, you probably saw the Wembanyama versus Scottie game, one of the early games in the season where the Raptors had the huge comeback. Do you remember when Scottie got the offensive rebound? Jeremy Sohan was on him, and they're supposed to be of a similar size. And Sohan took the bump and thought he would meet Scottie at the rim, but he met the inside of the rim because Scottie dunked all over him. Brook Lopez, Scottie had a 20-point fourth quarter last season where he was bashing Brook Lopez under the rim. He has, late in the Lakers game, right before you had Darko's big, blow up, you had Scottie in stride, taking 2 fouls from Max Christie, just boom, boom, taking it on the chest and dunking over him. And he's done that to Kevin Durant. He's done that against burly players. He's done it against skinny players. He's so strong and so capable of maintaining his line as a driver. It's tough to bump Scottie off of his line. And bumping a guy off his line is the easiest way to make a shot difficult going to the rim. So the free throw rate, I want to see that balloon from now until, the next calendar season of basketball. I'd love to see that as the big next step so that he can pressure, put guys in foul trouble, make the internal parts of defense quiver at the idea of him bashing and thrashing in there, because he's also a very controlled driver. OG is a guy who Raptors fans and now Knicks fans, OG's first time he tried, when the Raptors played the Knicks again, his first possession was a charge on RJ Barrett because he doesn't have the control during his drive. He's brutishly strong. Yeah, Scottie is controlled. He can walk you under the rim, which means the same way Jimmy Butler can walk guys under the rim, grift a little, get some of that craft. And especially with a guy with such good touch with both hands in Scottie, his contested hook shot percentage has always been near the top of the league. Grift a little, get to the line a little bit more often. That's the big next step. And that one seems so achievable for Scottie, to be quite honest with you. So, yeah.
What do you think of the job that Darko has done so far? Like, is there maybe one thing that's super impressed you versus one thing that you're still kind of concerned or think he needs to figure out moving forward? And I love getting to ask you or like a Caitlin Cooper or people who are just so much more or so much better at like the technical perspective. That's why I love asking these questions because aside from like rotations and lineups, like I just can't critique coaches with their schemes. Like I'm just not, I don't have that level of knowledge.
Sure. So there is actually, it's in the other room, but I have my notebook of a bunch of sets that I have of that I love of Darko's. Um, I think that Darko, from an X's and O's point of view, has done a really strong job. I think that like you see a lot of overlap between so many X's and O's in the NBA. Like the Raptors run something, the chances that like the Pacers also run it is pretty high. There'll be tweaks and stuff like that, but it's about frequency, it's about pace, it's about all that kind of stuff. And what Darko has been able to do, in my opinion, better than Nick Nurse was able to do, is Darko has been able to get guys to buy in on more weak side action. He's been able to get guys to buy in on more cutting, and he's been able to get guys to buy in on more pace. The injection of pace is super important in offense because it means your first action is being run at like 16 or 15. It means your second action is run at like, 11 or 12 instead of 7 or 6. And this means that if a defense has to like overload to stop what you're doing on that second or third action, it means like you might have time to like outpass the rotation. Because the rotation, they can pull from anywhere. They can start like Xing out, bringing guys from the weak side to cover, bringing a guy from like the paint out to the corner. There's no more rim defense. But if there's like 2 seconds on the clock, that shot has to go up. And that's the difference between initiating at 16 and 13 is that like when the center has to rotate to the corner, you can pump and go and have time to finish at the rim. That's the difference it makes. And that like you have that over the course of a season, you have a big difference in points per possession in the half court. It makes a big difference. So he's been able to, with his ethos, inject pace into the Raptors offense, inject timing, inject more movement. And even when the Raptors had like Scottie and Pascal and OG and largely the same offense, even prior to Immanuel and RJ coming over, their half court offense started to succeed at really high levels. It was one of the best in the NBA over the course of December with guys who had, under Nick Nurse, just consistently, even with Fred VanVleet, been like a really underperforming half court offense. He figured out with motion, with intent, how to get these guys to buy in. It's been rough lately because they're missing Pascal, who simplified so much of what they do, and it changes the hierarchy and makes things harder. But as far as like X's and O's on the clipboard, I think he's been immense. Some of the ATOs can use work, like you probably heard me talk about this on the podcast, running a twirl action on the wrong side for Immanuel Quickley due to his preferences as a shooter. That's something Darko will learn. And maybe that's just something he wanted to see. There's some stuff I've critiqued Darko on initially because I don't think he expected to be coaching Pascal. Pascal wasn't really part of any of the offense in the first,
He was like so separate, especially at the
yeah,
beginning of the season from what the Raptors were doing. It was
it
wild.
looked very similar to how he's being used with the Pacers right now, to be quite honest with you, except the Raptors kept him above the break and the Pacers are putting him in the corner a lot of times now. But that was only like 7 or 8 games. He eventually like figured out how to use Pascal, and Pascal was one of the most efficient scorers in all of the NBA towards the end of his tenure as a Raptor, I suppose. And they really sorted it out. It's been tough lately, but I think Darko, from that point of view, has been awesome. And then like rotations and stuff, I think he's been perhaps too rigid from a rotation standpoint.
Okay.
Like, the points in the game when guys are leaving. The points in the game when guys are coming in. He's not been so bendable there. But also, this is like data collection, right? That's like sometimes I find it hard to critique rotations from coaches because like they're just trying to see something. Like they're not always saying like, let's win these minutes. They don't go to cleaningtheglass.com and say, oh, these are the lineups that win minutes. Good. And like, as much as we want to believe that like, as analysts or as fans, like we stumble upon a lineup and say, this can you curse here? Or should
Yeah,
I?
you can say whatever you want.
Okay, so you say like, this fucking guy doesn't know the team he's coaching. Like, look, this is your best lineup. Play your best lineup. And when I was talking to Caitlin, she used this term that like pigs get fed, hogs get slaughtered. Is like that lineup might be succeeding in like a small sample size or something like that, but the coaches might be in their film seeing some stuff that like, well, we hit some threes with this lineup that might not stay. And there's also these things that we got lucky on the defensive end that like this might not maintain over time. There's like all those considerations. So especially for a team that's not that good. And I'm not like, oh, if you just play like these 5-man lineups, they'd win games.
He'd just play Malachi Flynn. They never would have needed to make the trade. They'd be
exactly.
Conference.
They would have sorted it out, like that kind of stuff. For really good teams, yeah, nail the lineups. Like win as much as you can. And it's your responsibility to sort that stuff out really fast. There's not as much room for error. But for like a first-year coach who is instilling a new system, is already seeing like ridiculous offensive returns with it. There's been mistakes, I think, on the rotation side. He's admitted as such, but like these are small things. And players love him. He's really well liked, which is
I'd love him too if he called me the face of the league.
Yeah. Well, that was also that's the piece I wrote the other day. Like with Darko, the last game against Memphis, like I'm walking out of the tunnel. Darko like is alongside me, shake hands, say hi or whatever. I walk with him to the court. He goes out and like immediately is embracing Desmond Bane, who he had a huge role in his development. He's like talking with him. They share hugs. They catch up, all that kind of stuff. I get a nice little picture of it. We walk to the other side of the court. He immediately goes to Gradey Dick, starts going through some of the like stuff they want to work on with his footwork in the corner, then sits behind him, observes what he's teaching, all this kind of stuff. He is a development coach at heart. And he said that's the most rewarding part of his job when I asked him about it. And so that kind of stuff is really important for a team that is in a rebuild. And those are qualities that I think a lot of people expect to be, in assistant coaches or like dev coaches or something like that. But why couldn't it be part of what a head coach does, right? Is like making time for guys. And when I asked Taylor Jenkins about it, who was Darko's head coach in Memphis, he was like, whether you're on a 10-day or whether you're a star, like he gives you the time. So
that's cool.
Guys love him. He has bona fides, like he has testimonials from all over the NBA. He's really well liked. And also changing from Nick Nurse, who was a tremendous coach, but was also kind of like a tremendous ass, was that, but that was the problem, right? Is like Nick Nurse is really high level coach. We're seeing that with Philadelphia, but it goes back to that Larry Bird thing where Larry Bird said a coach only has like 3 or 4 years, something like that, right? Before like you can grade on each other, before like it might wear thin.
Yeah.
And there's not really anybody's fault necessarily, but Nick Nurse just didn't have the room anymore. He's pretty hard guy in the media, pretty hard guy.
They didn't want to play for him. Wonder if Masai was in his ears like, you don't want to play for this guy.
Yeah. But he's pretty tough on his players. He asks a lot, and that didn't last on a team that was underachieving, so but he's doing great things in Philly, and Darko, I think, is helping change the culture to something different in Toronto, which is something Toronto needed. And a lot of Raptors fans don't like Darko necessarily.
Oh, really?
I think there were a lot of expectations for this team that I didn't share coming into this season about like success, and Darko hasn't necessarily coached this team to a bunch of wins, and like people want to see wins. So there's some stuff like that, but I think a lot of people who are taking the longer road quite appreciate what he's been able to do. And I think that there are seeds being planted that will grow into like plants of success. I don't know where that's going. But yeah, I think like I've been impressed with the coaching job so far, to be quite honest.
I will say, as a far away observer, just the aesthetics of the offense are so much more palatable. And I can't remember whether I thought it, wrote it, or said it on this podcast, but last year I would describe the Raptors half-court offense as sloggy and clumpy. And this year, the sloggy element was gone for most of it. And it's like, to your point about the pace too, is a lot of people look at their transition frequency from years past, and like that is an element of pace, but like they were 27th in average offensive possession time last year after opponents made a shot. This year, they're 10th and they're 5th since the first trade, which is just like that. To me, that's just more watchable. The efficiency element, we know that's down since the trade. But that just makes them more watchable. So I tip my cap to him for making the Raptors offense just more aesthetically pleasing for someone like me.
And also, like we talked about that donation, he turned one of the lowest assist rate teams into one of the highest in the NBA and said, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. So,
Yeah, come bankrupt your coach, players,
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
always a good motivational tool. Very quickly, are you at all concerned about the lack of role or just how of Gradey Dick or just how Gradey Dick is played this year? Or is it just you can't necessarily bring yourself to when you're looking at the opportunity he's had versus his just being a rookie and the context of this team being in such this perpetual state of lurch that it's not something that you're really worried about?
Well done. Perpetual state of lurch is very good. Gradey, I think he's gotten as much opportunity as he deserves.
Okay.
When I was in summer league and I talked to Gradey, one of the first things we talked about was that he was gassed. The NBA court was bigger. And Gradey in workouts also, like, conditioning was a thing for him. He didn't come into the NBA with the NBA body. He is really young. He is a guy who his calves are as thick as his thighs. He's got kind of slow feet. Like, he has to work really hard to get like NBA conditioning. And I don't think he met that. The Raptors in the new year, perhaps a little bit before it, put Gradey on like a workout program. They want him to put on weight, more muscle, all that kind of stuff. And they like conditioning is something that I think was the biggest factor for him underperforming his shooting, was being kind of gassed, getting around the NBA court, being a movement shooter. Because his brain, hell of a basketball brain on that guy. Like, you watch him make decisions as a passer. You watch him make decisions as a cutter. It's like in the school of Steph Curry. Always move, always find the open space, always shape to the ball. Like, he's really cerebral in that way. What that also requires, and people didn't talk about it for the first couple of years, but everyone finally started talking like, man, Steph Curry's in great shape. And guys started saying like, I can't guard that fucking guy because he runs so goddamn much. Grady's brain has been telling him like, run, find open space, boom, 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 boom. But then he gets the ball and he's gassed. So conditioning has been a big thing for him that will improve. His reads as a cutter, his reads as a playmaker are so advanced relative to what you expect from a shooter or movement shooter. He just has to make the shots. Defense was always going to be something that like was not going to be strong right away, and it hasn't been. Just waiting on the jumper to fall. And he has such a long history of like being a shooter in different contexts, whether it was like you're just waiting for it to hit at the NBA level. And honestly, if he can't shoot at the NBA level, then like the Raptors miss evaluation, all of the NBA miss evaluation, like then it's just tough because all of the cool stuff he does is like a fantastic cutter and a guy who like rebounds way better than most shooters, a guy who has way more size than most shooters, a guy who passes extremely well, who like his cut will drag the weak side and he knows he's dragging the weak side in and he knows how he's affecting the floor. All that stuff is so good, but it doesn't mean a lick if he can't shoot it. And he hasn't been able to shoot it very well. Do I think he's going to shoot it? Yes. Do I wish that like it was better immediately? Sure. But if you're relying on a rookie to be like a pivotal shooter for you, you're obviously the Miami Heat, God damn them. Or you're like just, you can't rely on that. So it's been up and down for him. I'm still firmly, I hold the Gradey stock in my hand. I still feel good about Gradey going forward. It's like, maybe Blake tweeted this, maybe like since 2019 or 2020, 70% of lottery picks play in the G League at this point. So
Right.
like it's not a bad thing. Raptors fans were like, give me Jarris. Jarris has spent a lot of time in the G League too, right? Like
Exclusively almost.
yeah, exactly. So I don't feel bad about Gradey. I wish he had more success early on, but like I like Gradey. He's got a great head on his shoulders, and you're just waiting on a shooter to start hitting shots and like some conditioning, some strength, but it'll come around.
I'm just a sucker for the pinball-y guys, and he kind of has like a pinball element. I know you mentioned like he could be slower on defense, but like he'll pinball around on defense too. And so I'm
Yep.
just a sucker for those types of players. So I'll be rooting for him. Is there anyone about this team I didn't ask you about you think needs to be discussed, or is there any league-wide takes or questions or thoughts that you have that you need to throw my way before we get out of here?
I don't. Who's your favorite player on the Raptors right now?
Ooh, it's probably I mean, I love Scott. I mean, it's Chris Boucher. That is like I'm just that's like my not so guilty pleasure. But I love Immanuel Quickley. He's just so there's like a suddenness to the way that he plays on offense. And I love that just abruption, whether it's like him in the lane or the way that he's launching his threes. And then as you kind of mentioned, the off-ball defense is like I always appreciate players that I enjoy watching away from the action on defense. And so he's always been like a favorite watch of mine. And
So
look, when
some
Scottie's hitting his turnarounds or like those contested hook shots, those are just, I love those things too. So those are
yeah.
probably my top 3 Raptors guys right now.
Can I just before we get out of here then, Chris Boucher, the player, I felt like a lot of the pieces I wrote over the last 3 years has kind of been like explaining with film and data how he wins his minutes, and that like as crazy and as like chaotic it might look, it's like sometimes controlled chaos and like an agent of chaos, that kind of stuff, right? But I just like if you have a soliloquy on Chris Boucher, who may not be a Raptor for much longer. What's your thoughts on his game as a whole? Like wax poetic about one of your favorites.
As I mentioned before, and I mean, you call it controlled chaos. There's just like an anarchy to the way he plays, and you don't know what's going to happen on his closeouts. And I've always been the players who they are not this when you dig into the numbers or some of their film, but they can be this, like the floor stretching rim protectors that are also going to like their rim protection isn't necessarily built on IQ, it's on playmaking. Like because you're going to chase those blocks and those highlight swats, and he's one of the OGs, it feels like, of the past 5 years or so of doing it from
Yeah.
the perimeter. Like, and sometimes his closeouts are just like, yes, there could be fouls, but he could also just like, he'll go off to the side and end up with like the 4th row or something. Like, you just don't know what's going to happen. And I always thought that he could be a better, not necessarily like a catch and decision make guy in the lane, but I thought that in the right context, he could be an even better, like, rim running threat than he's ever been, just because he did kind of have the sort of the vertical element. He has those like really, I would use the word broad shoulders. Like he could be a better screener at points. So even when the 3-point shot isn't falling, and I know his splits are kind of like all over the place ever since he signed that contract, I just still think he could be an intensely useful player for a good team. And when I combine that belief with just the fact that there's just this anarchy, it's designed anarchy, it's contrived anarchy, and I love it. Like it's just like I said, a not so guilty pleasure is Chris Boucher. Him and just because you're new to the pod, Frank Ntilikina is like my siren song.
Sure.
I don't remember. I think I compared him to like what if Avery Bradley was actually good on the offensive end when he came into the league, and I just like I'm still smitten. Like I think there's a fluidity to Frank Ntilikina. It's like these are the players I latch on to.
I think what you mentioned about the pick and roll stuff, we got that for a little bit in the Tampa season for the Raptors, where Chris Boucher, he was like scoring the hell out of the ball repeatedly all the time. And a lot of it was like, yeah, he had a pretty good season shooting the 3, but also like pick and roll stuff, playing with Kyle Lowry helps. But
Yeah.
like a lot of those pocket passes where he's sprinting into the lane, vertical pop for sure. I wrote this piece last year on Chris Boucher. It was like Chris Boucher, king of dunks, where he's like, just because of his aesthetics, nobody considers that like this guy puts together one of the best like dunking highlight reels in a given season. But he did last year. He had like 20 insane dunks, just like stretching to the heavens, skyscraping stuff. And, like there's a lot of guys who they take off from like below the dotted line. But if Chris is on the fast break or something like that, he'll take off from above it. There's just a lot of like energy and length, and it's infectious. And he's also a guy who just like, I like Chris a lot. He's very forthcoming. I find he's very honest with him about his game and himself, and that stuff is very humanizing, I think. So yeah, he's an awesome player for sure. And Frankie Smokes, hell yeah.
Yeah, look, Frankie Smokes back from injury. It's like the turnaround or the renaissance. Well, I guess it would actually be just the the career pop. It's coming now, that initial one. And look, it's also fun, like with Chris Boucher, is I know it was only really the Warriors that weren't a team that they had him and they got rid of him. But like when you see someone get waived and it's like they're on an exhibit 10 with the Raptors at one point to turn into someone who gets there. I did at the time, and I'll stick by it. I called it one of the best contracts of that summer that he signed, like on this deal. I thought it was a bargain. It's always cool to see that story where it's like, oh, this guy he was waived, he was on an exhibit 10, and like now has this real contract and is a real member of this team. So I'm always gonna love those types of stories too.
Yeah, he's great.
Samson, this was great. Thank you for giving me 80 plus minutes of your time. I really appreciate it. Are you able just to tell our listeners where they can find you and all the fantastic work that you do?
You can find my stuff at raptorsrepublic.com. If you like the Raptors, I do a live show after every game on YouTube. You just type in Raptors Republic on YouTube if you're interested. And a lot of the written work is paywalled. There's this unique thing for American listeners in Canada where basically basketball coverage is under a duopoly between two big tech things. And Raptors Republic is independent. Most of the best writers and analysts, the biggest ones in Toronto, actually started with Raptors Republic. And now Raptors Republic is trying to maintain talent. The way we do this is through a subscription base because it seems like that's the strongest way to, I don't know, not get everyone laid off and to not have stuff happen anymore, to just have things disappear. We're trying to rely on, I guess, crowdfunding or subscription model to some degree. So if you like really good writing from like an X's and O standpoint, a play style standpoint, a unique quotes and insight standpoint, that's what we do. So if I don't know if I've ever heard a plug that got me to spend money necessarily. I had to like go read the work or something like that, or watch the work. But if you like me, hey, that's how you support. So thank you. Mostly just thank you for listening to 80 minutes of Dan and I talking, because that's a hell of a, like, you've invested into us. So thank you.
Yes, and look, I've gotten DMs from people who've come on that they have gotten more subscribers off of coming on the show. So listeners, do the same thing. I don't need to hear it from Samson, but go subscribe to Raptors Republic. Great writing and podcasting video content over there. The link will be in the podcast and YouTube description. Samson, thank you so much again. Rest assured, I'll be pestering you again in the future, but this was so great. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Dan.